Bueno, Wade Davis, un placer estar aquí esta tarde para que hablemos sobre el libro sobre el río Magdalena, que en inglés tiene el título de Magdalena River of Dreams, el río de los sueños. La primera pregunta, ustedes conocido en Colombia por haber escrito el libro El río, que tiene que ver con sus viajes en la zona del Amazonas, siguiendo las huellas de su mentor en la Universidad de Harvard, Richard Ivan Schultes. En ese libro cuenta usted, en el nuevo libro, que usted menciona el Magdalena 5 o 6 veces nada más. La pregunta obvia es, ¿por qué ahora escribe sobre el Magdalena?
La Magdalena es la historia de Colombia, y Colombia como un país es un regalo del río Magdalena, ¿no? But everybody in Colombia has a kind of an amnesia about the river. You know, we turn our back on the river that gave life to the country. And I had been as guilty of that as anybody. You know, in the 1970s, I must have crossed the Magdalena 50 times, a lo menos. Pero siempre viajando a las fronteras del país, Putumayo, Guaviare, Chocó, cualquier sitio, la Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And, you know, in the same way that the people from Bogotá talk about going down to Girardot, they just say, estamos bajando a Tierra Caliente, but no one understands that Tierra Caliente is la cuenca del Rio Magdalena. You know, there's a kind of a collective amnesia. Even Schultes, you know, I took thousands of photographs in Colombia, which is what allowed me to write the book El Rio as I did. But I can't remember a single photograph of the Rio Magdalena. And I think one of the themes that emerged as we traveled the Cuenca is this sort of sense that people have treated the river like a cemetery. They've treated the river as a place for basura, they have life. And yet at the same time, you always hear the same message. To heal our lives, we must heal the river.
El libro tiene una construcción extraordinaria porque narra la historia de Colombia a lo largo del recorrido desde el Bajo Magdalena hasta su desembocadura. Y no deja de ser llamativo el contraste entre esa inmensa belleza natural, incluyendo la belleza natural que desapareció por la deforestación de la cuenca del río, pero al mismo tiempo con esa historia nuestra de violencia que viene desde la época de la conquista. ¿Cómo reconciliar esa enorme y aparente contradicción de la vida tan presente en forma de la naturaleza y la muerte tan presente, incluso en las aguas de un río, que, como lo dice en sus páginas, podría ser el ataúd más grande que existe?
You know, es algo you know, it's something about the spirit of the place, of a land that is so dynamic, so volatile. You know, in the book, the story of Murillo versus Armero es tan interesante. Hay un capítulo en el libro que tiene el título El milagro de Murillo, porque, bueno, la historia de Armero es bien conocida en Colombia. You know, hay 30,000 muertos en una noche, ¿no? En 85. Una tristeza, una cosa tan terrible, un tragedia tan enorme. But the wonderful story, la historia increíble, es que that same day there was a miracle in Colombia, and it began in Murillo, way up on the flank, al lado del Nevado de Ruiz. And, you know, all of that mountain should have crushed Murillo as it crushed Armero. And it came down, and I spoke to a woman, Adelfa, una vieja, una mujer con una cara tan como, her face looked like the map of Colombia, with all of its rivers and all of its mountains and all of its deserts, all of its streams. And she told me that God left Murillo, the day that Jorge Gaitan died. You know, the assassination in 1948 of Jorge Gaitan. For her, that was the day that all hope died, that God left the town. And she told me that. And then I thought, well, that's interesting. ¿Por qué estás diciendo eso en ese momento? ¿Por qué? And then she said, but then God returned. And let me tell you about the day that God returned. Y empezó a contar la historia de ese la día tan terrible, ¿no? Everybody was gathered by the church in the Plaza of Murillo. The priest was wailing. Women and children were crying. Mothers were reaching out to their hands to read the faces of their children, like reading Braille, because everything was pitch black. And then they heard a roar. The entire mountain of Ruiz came down, but instead of coming over the town, it was caught by a ridge and it went right by the town. And on the day that everybody died in Armero, nobody died in Murillo. And so it's not to say that the events in Armero were not terrible and should not be remembered, but at the same time, let's remember the miracle of Murillo that happened the same day. And that to me is sort of the essence of Colombia. You know, yes, you have a river that becomes a cemetery of the nation, but you also have Puerto Barrio, you know, where when the Paraco said, no, usted no puede tocar ninguno de los muertos. Ellos tienen que estar en el río, como la comida de los pescados, but you know. And one by one, they said no. And they took those bodies and they didn't just baptize them. They gave them their family names. And so, you know, the point in all of this is not to say that Colombia is perfect any more than any other nation's perfect. Not to say that Colombia hasn't, you know, had its you know, its dark moments in its history. Obviously it has. But, you know, we have this idea in the Christian tradition of good and evil. When the Buddha says, you know, all life is suffering, they don't mean all life is negative. It means that we live in a world of duality. We live in a world of good and evil. And I see that happening in every country in the world. And it's just that in Colombia, everything is on steroids. You know, you know, why wouldn't this all happen in Colombia? Because you know, I mean, I don't mean to be glib with that, and I don't mean to in any way, you know, minimize the suffering. But to remember that only a people like the Colombians could have endured what they did.
Una interrupción antes de eso. Por esa razón, tal vez es que usted cita a Borges cuando dice que ser colombiano es un acto de fe.
Yeah. You know, I think Colombia is like that. You know, every people is a product of its geography, of their geography, and you know, the extraordinary thing about Colombia, which is why I find the arrieros so enchanting. You know, I mean, you know, some people can, you know, I don't know, go into trance when they hear a Mozart symphony, or sometimes people will, you know, get all excited about seeing a beautiful piece of theater. For me, I get excited when I see an arriero packing a mule, because when I see that, a window opens onto the entire history of the country of Colombia, you know, and you know, this wild and impossible geography is reflected in the topography of the Colombian spirit. At moments calm, endearing, in moments volcanic and eruptive, you know. And for me, you know, I don't know, you know, Ricardo, how to explain this, and I'm always careful not to appear to be naive, because I am certainly, as the book makes clear, not naive about the history of Colombia. Somehow, Colombia could match and in its own kind of craziness could match what was inside my head and allow me to become the scholar that I became. It's hard to explain. I can't really explain it. You know, it's sort of like, it's something so visceral. You know, I mean, a lot of people fly into El Dorado and, you know, oh, they can smell the exhaust and the fumes of Bogota. I don't smell the When I land in Bogota, I don't smell cars. I don't smell pollution. I smell the plants of the savannah. I can smell already from the airport the paramos. I can feel the rivers falling on my body. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it's just because I found my life in Colombia when I was so young. I was 14 years old. And in 1968, I came from a very simple family in Canada. My mother worked as a secretary in a tiny little school, to send me on that trip with all these rich kids from Montreal. And I was only 14 and they were 16. And they were all, in the fancy homes in Cali and the Club Campestre and all this stuff, and I was with this modest family up in Dapa. And I just I just had never seen anything like this. The energy, the intensity, the affection, the warmth. It sounds silly, but these things when you're young are important. I never hugged my mother. I never was kissed by my father. It just didn't happen in Canada. I felt like I had gone from a black and white world of Canada to a kaleidoscopic world of color and warmth and people who who knew all the contradictions of life and yet still had a gentle understanding of the frailty of the human spirit. I don't know.
En el libro usted dice, Colombia no se merece sus miserias. ¿Qué quiere decir con eso?
Colombia, dime otra vez.
Colombia doesn't deserve its miseries.
Well, exactly, but that's my point. I was doing a speech the other day for Burning Man, right? And these sort of young hipsters from California were sort of saying to me, well, what do we really want to say about the message of your book? And I just said to them, have you ever met anyone who used cocaine? Oh, yeah. Well, I'll tell you something. Every one of you is a murderer. Every one of you has blood of Colombian people on your hands. In other words, that may sound extreme, but it's true. It's like my friend Sandra, un paisa, puro paisa de Medellín. And she had to flee to, this is a classic, she had to flee to Miami to live with her grandmother because she could no longer distinguish the sound of thunder from the sound of bombs. And when she got to Miami, she was made fun of for being from the land of Escobar by teenagers in the high school in Miami whose main social activity was the pursuit of drugs, with cocaine being their drug of choice. And Sandra had never used cocaine. She had never seen cocaine. And to me, that's kind of a metaphor for this. And when I say Colombia hasn't deserved its miseries, this is a country that despite what other country could have gone through this period of conflict, a three-way civil war, if you will, with levels of depravity that make any human being shudder, and yet still maintain its civil society and its democracy, green its cities, seek restitution with its indigenous people, unlike any other nation state, created millions of acres of national parks, and also paved the way for an economic renaissance. Because one of the, there are two kind of good things that came out of the conflict, or two benefits of peace. One is the fact that vast areas of Colombia, isolated by the conflict, are now, it has a choice an opportunity to make decisions based on 50 years of scientific research as to the importance of both biological and cultural diversity. The second great peace dividend, if you will, is the fact that hundreds of, indeed probably thousands of young Colombians forced to leave the country over the last 2 generations are coming home. And they're coming home from Paris and New York and Los Angeles and Moscow and every capital in the world with skill sets in every conceivable endeavor. And I think that has a promise of an economic and cultural revival. And already Colombia has, this infrastructure of fantastic universities and cultural institutions. If given a chance, Colombia is just going to flower in remarkable ways. But again, it keeps coming back to cocaine. Unless nation states have the wisdom to invoke the cleansing stroke of legalization or doing something to eradicate this dreadful trade and prohibition has not worked, it's hard to see how this won't continue to be a thorn of instability in the side of Colombia.
Usted se describe a sí mismo como un optimista, que por cierto, siendo usted colombiano, es curioso porque la mayoría de los colombianos son pesimistas, según las encuestas. ¿Por qué es usted optimista?
Bueno, es que después de 50 años de guerra, es normal que una persona va a ser pesimista. ¿No? I mean, it's, Colombia, the other thing is that we forget it's not just 50 years of war. It's 2 generations of being reduced to caricature, a pariah state. Carolina Barco, a friend of mine, daughter of Virgilio Barco, the president, was the ambassador to Washington. She, daughter of a president, former external affairs minister of Colombia. She went through customs in Dulles Airport, she told me, and she got stripped, searched, just because she was from Colombia. And when they asked for her, when she presented her diplomatic credentials, they laughed at her. I mean, so there's a psychological impact of not just the constant threat of violence, which is terrible enough, but from the external clichés that have been placed upon the country.
Usted señala de manera central que la redención de Colombia pasa por literalmente limpiar el río, limpiar el Magdalena. ¿Por qué?
The most important lesson of COVID, in a way, is that we're biological beings on a living planet. The lesson should be that we live on a biological planet. And, Colombia is very fortunate in that you have indigenous people who are still here to remind us of other ways of being and other possibilities. And so when the Barasana or the Macuna or the Tanimucos of the Rio Paraná in the Valpes, that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality, well, there's a lesson there. And when the mamos say that the water the blood that runs through your veins is no different than the water that runs through a river, we should pay attention. The Arahuacos and the Kogi, the Wiwa, would actually walk from the mouth, la boca, hasta la Laguna de la Magdalena in el Macizo Colombiano, the fountain of the river, the source of the river. They would walk all that way, and they would get to every village, and they would measure the health of the community by the way they treated the river. And they believed that the river was a reflection of the consciousness of the people, and the consciousness of the people was infused in the river. And again, it's not about whether this is true or not scientifically. What matters is the metaphor that it represents, the realization that we are, biological beings on a living planet, and we are dependent on these rivers. I mean, it's just sort of, crazy if you think about it, that we don't baptize our children with milk. We baptize our children with water. We drip crosses on, we turn water into sacred essence for the most important moment in a child's life. And then we turn around and dump our garbage into the river in a way that is shameful. Is that rivers have an incredible capacity to regenerate. The amazing thing about the Magdalena is that you could clean up the Rio Magdalena relatively easily simply because of the regenerative power of the rivers themselves. I mean, even the Rio Bogota, its pathogen and toxicity levels drops by the time it gets to Hirado. And if you could clean up the Rio Magdalena, think of the symbol that it would send to the world, that a country torn asunder by violence and civil conflict for 50 years has cleaned up the river that gave its life. The river was named after Maria Magdalena, and which was odd because for so much of history, she was sort of a darkened woman associated as if she was a woman of the night. And only in 2013, 2014, I can't remember, when Pope Francis finally elevated her to her legitimate status. And 3 billion people raised to believe that Maria Magdalena was a whore, now revere her a generation later as a saint. And as Sandra said that, she suddenly said, you know, why can't we do that to the river?
No se diga más. Muchísimas gracias. Wait, voy a detener la grabación aquí. De verdad que muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's wonderful to be with you.